The Nature of the Psyche, Its Human Expression by Jane Roberts. And this is session 765, February 2nd, 1976, 9:23 p.m. Monday. And this is Seth speaking now. Distorted ideas about sexuality prevent many people from attaining any close connection with the inner experience that continually stirs beneath ordinary consciousness. It is a good idea, then, to look at the psyche and its relationship to sexual identity. The psyche is not male or female. In your system of beliefs, however, it is often identified as feminine, along with the artistic productions that emerge from its creativity. In that context, the day hours and the waking consciousness are thought of as masculine, along with the sun, while the nighttime, the moon, and the dreaming consciousness are considered feminine or passive. In the same manner, aggression is usually understood to be violent, assertive action, male-oriented, while female elements are identified in terms of the nurturing principle. Physically speaking, you would have no males or females unless first you had individuals. You are each individuals first of all, then. After this, you are individuals of a specific sex, biologically speaking. The particular kind of focus that you have is responsible for the great significance you place upon male and female. Your hand and your foot have different functions. If you wanted to focus upon the differences in their behavior, you could build an entire culture based upon their diverse capabilities, functions, and characteristics. Hands and feet are obviously equipment belonging to both sexes, however, still on another level, the analogy is quite valid. The psyche is male and female, female and male. But when I say this, I realize that you put your own definitions upon those terms to begin with. Biologically, the sexual orientation is the method chosen for continuation of the species. Otherwise, however, no specific psychological characteristics of any kind are attached to that biological functioning. I am quite aware that in your experience, definite physical and psychological differences do exist. Those that do are the result of programming and are not inherent, even biologically, in the species itself. The vitality of the species, in fact, was assured because it did not over-specialize in terms of sexuality. There was no fixed mating period, for example. Instead, the species could reproduce freely so that, in the event of a catastrophe of any kind, it would not be so tied into rigid patterns that might result in extinction. The challenges and problems of the species were different from those of others. It needed additional safeguards. The more flexible mating pattern was one. With this came greater diversity in individual characteristics and behavior, so that no individual was bound to a strictly biological role. If that were true, the species never would have been concerned beyond the issues of physical survival, and such is not the case. The species could have survived quite well physically without philosophy, the arts, politics, religion, or even structured language. It could have followed completely different paths, those tied strictly to biological orientation. There would have been no question of men performing so-called feminine tasks or women performing so-called masculine tasks, for there no leeway for that kind of individual action would have existed. For that kind of individual action would have existed. For that matter, there is far greater leeway in the behavior of animals than you understand, for you interpret animal behavior according to your own beliefs. You interpret the past history of your species in the same manner. It seems to you that the female always tended to the offspring, for example, nursing them, and that she was forced to remain close to home while the male fought off enemies or hunted for food. The ranging male, therefore, appears to have been much more curious and aggressive. There was instead a different kind of situation. Children do not come in litters. The family of the caveman was a far more democratic group than you suppose. Men and women working side by side, children learning to hunt with both parents, women stopping to nurse a child along the way, the species standing apart from others because it was not ritualized in sexual behavior. Except for the fact that males could not bear children, the abilities of the sexes were interchangeable. The male was usually heavier, a handy physical advantage in some areas, but the woman was lighter and could run faster. Women were also somewhat lighter because they could bear the additional weight of a child. Even then, of course, there were variances, for many women are larger than small men, but the women could hunt as well as the men. In compassion, kindness, and gentleness if compassion, kindness, and gentleness were feminine characteristics only, then no male could be kind or compassionate, because such feelings would not be biologically possible. If your individuality was programmed by your biological sex, then it would be literally impossible for you to perform any action that was not sexually programmed. A woman cannot father a child, nor can a male bear one, since you are otherwise free to perform other kinds of activity that you would think of as sexually oriented. In those areas, the orientation is cultural. You imagine, however, that the male is aggressive, active, logical-minded, inventive, outwardly oriented, a builder of civilizations. You identify the ego as male. The unconscious, therefore, seems to be female, and the feminine characteristics are usually given as passive, intuitive, nurturing, creative, uninventive, concerned with preserving the status quo, disliking change. At the same time, you consider the intuitive elements rather frightening, as if they can explode to disrupt known patterns in unknown ways. Males who are creatively gifted find themselves in some dilemma, for their rich, sensed creativity comes into direct conflict with their areas of virility. Women who possess characteristics are thought to be masculine, have the same problem on the other side. In your terms, the psyche is a repository of characteristics that operate in unison, composed of female and male elements. The human psyche contains such patterns that can be put together in a multitudinous way. They have categorized human abilities so that it seems that you are men or women and men primarily, and persons secondarily. Your personhood exists first, however. Your individuality gives meaning to your sex, and not the other way around. In direct opposition to current theories about the past, there was far less sexual specialization, say, in the time of the caveman than now. The family was a very cooperative unit. The basis of early society was cooperation, not competition. Families grouped together. There were children of various ages in such a band all the time. When women were near birth, they performed those chores that could be done in the cave dwellings or nearby, and also watched other young children, while the women who were not pregnant were off with the males hunting or gathering food. If a mother died, the father took over the responsibilities, the qualities of love and affection being quite as alive in him as in the female. After a woman bore, she nursed the child, taking it with her on food-gathering excursions, or sometimes letting other women in the group nurse the child. Often after childbirth, women immediately joined the hunting expeditions, and the fathers made clothing from animal hides at home. This allowed the male to rest after prolonged hunting activity and meant that no adult member of a family became overexhausted. The work then was interchangeable. Children began food gathering and hunting as soon as they were able to, females as well as males, led by the older children, going farther away as they progressed in strength. Qualities of inventiveness, curiosity, ingenuity could not be delegated to one sex alone. The species could not have survived such a division. You are so used to thinking in terms of mechanics that it seems to you that uneducated people did not understand the connection between the sexual act of intercourse and childbirth. You are so used to one kind of explanation for childbirth, so familiar with one specific framework, that alternate explanations appear to be the height of nonsense. So it is fashionable to believe that early man did not understand the connection between intercourse and birth. Even the animals, however, understand without words or language the importance of their sexual behavior. Early man was hardly more ignorant. The male knew what he was doing, even without textbooks that outlined the entire procedure. The female understood the connections between the child born and the sexual act. It is the height of idiocy to imagine that because of the time taken in pregnancy, the female could not understand the child's origin in intercourse. The body's knowledge did not need a complicated language. For that matter, your literal interpretation of childbirth is, by some standards, a highly limited one. In your terms, it is technically correct. But a child born to two parents is also an offspring of the earth. Its tissues as surely a part of the earth as any tree or flower or burst of ocean spray. A human child, true, but an offspring in which the entire history of the earth is involved. A new creation arising not just from two parents, but from the entire gestalt of nature, from which the parents themselves once emerged. A private yet public affair in which the physical elements of earth became individualized, in which Psyche and earth cooperate in a birth that is human and, in other terms, divine. Historically speaking, early man, in his way, understood those connections far better than you do, and used language as he developed it to express first of all this miracle of birth, for he saw that he constantly replenished his kind, and that all other species were replenished in the same way. There was always more land. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he traveled, early man could not run out of land or trees or forests or food supplies. If he came to a desert, he still knew that fertile lands were somewhere available, even if it was a matter of finding them. But the world itself seemed to have no end. It was literally a limitless world, in a way most difficult for you to understand, for to you the world has shrunk. This unlimited world constantly replenished itself. Children came from mothers' wombs Man was acquainted with death, and many children were stillborn or were naturally aborted. This also, however, was in the natural order of things, and was done far more easily than it is now. All flower seeds do not fall on fertile ground and bring forth other flowers. The seeds that do not grow go back into the ground, forming the basis for other life. Biologically speaking, fetuses grow and develop. I am going slowly here because I am being tricky. And when innate consciousness emerges with proper form, the conditions are right for the birth of a healthy child. When the conditions are not right, the child does not develop properly. Nature aborts it. The physical elements return to the earth to become the basis for other life. Only those children perfectly attuned to their environment in time and space survived. This does not mean that the consciousness of a child was annihilated, for example, if it was naturally aborted. It did not develop. While there was no mating period, still there was a close biological relationship between the species and the earth, so that women naturally conceived when situations of climate, food supplies, and other elements were beneficial. Biologically, the species knew ahead of time when droughts would appear, for example, and it automatically altered its rate of conception to compensate. Left alone, animal species do the same thing. In broad terms, early man was struck by the fact that all things seem to reproduce themselves, and it was this fact that first caught his attention. Later, he used what you think of as myths to explain this abundance, yet those myths contained a kind of knowledge that escapes your literal, specific interpretations of sexual events. Such knowledge resides in the psyche, however. If you have any direct experience with your own psyche, then you will most likely find yourself encountering some kinds of events that will not easily fit with your own ideas about your sexual nature. And then he says, dictation. The continuation of our sexual fireside chat. The remark is an aside and not necessarily part of the book, although it may be if you prefer. Your beliefs about sexuality and hence your experience with it makes you consider it in a very limiting light. The psyche's own knowledge, of course, is far more expansive. Alterations of consciousness or attempts on the part of the individual to explore the inner self may then easily display glimpses of a kind of sexuality that can appear to be deviant or unnatural. Even when social scientists or biologists explore human sexuality, they do so from the framework of sexuality as it appears in your world. There are quite natural sexual variations, even involving reproduction, that are not now apparent in human behavior in any culture. These variations appear in your world on only fairly microscopic levels or in the behavior of other species than your own. When racial conditions require it, it's quite possible for an individual to both father and mother a child. And then there's an asterisk and a footnote that it points to, and it says in the footnote, in these passages, Seth refers to a phenomena similar to parthenogenesis, the reproduction of an unfertilized ovum seed, or spore, as in some polyzoans, insects, algae, and so forth. There's also artificial parthenogenesis, brought about by the development of an ovum that's mechanically or chemically stimulated. Okay, so I'm going to start that sentence again. And let's see. When racial conditions require it, it's quite possible for an individual to both father and mother a child. In such cases, what you would call complete spontaneous sexual reverses or transformations would occur. Such processes are quite possible at microscopic levels and inherent in the cellular structure. Even in your world, currently speaking, some individuals, known as women, could father their own children. Some individuals, known as men, could give birth to a child fathered by the same person. Could is underlined. The abilities are there. The male-female, female-male orientation is not nearly as separate as it appears to be in your present experience. It is not nearly as tied to psychological characteristics as you suppose, nor is it inherently focused in the particular age period in which it now shows itself. Puberty arrives, so to speak, but the time of its arrival varies according to the needs of the species, its conditions, and beliefs. You are an individual for life. You operate as a reproducing individual, generally speaking, for only a portion of that time. During that period, many elements come into play and are meant to make the process attractive to the individuals involved. A relatively strong sexual identification is important under those circumstances, but an over-identification with them, before or afterward, can lead to stereotyped behavior in which the greater needs and abilities of the individual are not allowed fulfillment. All of this becomes very complicated because of your value judgments, which oftentimes seem to lack, if you forgive me, all natural common sense. You cannot separate biology from your own belief systems. The interplay is too vital. If each act of intercourse were meant to produce a child, you would have overrun the planet before you began. Sexual activity is therefore also meant as enjoyment, or as an expression of pure exuberance. A woman will often feel her most sexually active in the midst of the menstrual period, precisely when conception is least apt to occur. All kinds of taboos against sexual relationships have been applied here, particularly in so-called native cultures. In those cultures, such taboos make good sense. Such people, building up the human stock, intuitively knew that the population would be increased if relations were restricted to periods when conception was most likely to occur. The blood was an obvious sign that the woman at her period was relatively barren. Her abundance was gone. It seemed to their minds that she was indeed cursed during that time. I have spoken before about the growth of what you call ego consciousness, which, let me reiterate here, has its own unique rewards. That psychological orientation will lead the species to another equally unique kind of consciousness. When the process began, however, the deep power of nature had to be controlled so that the growing consciousness would see itself as apart from this natural source. Yet children, so necessary to the species, continued to spring from their mother's wombs. Therefore, the natural source was most flagrant, observable, and undeniable. For that reason, the species, and not the male alone, placed so many taboos about female behavior and sexuality. In subduing its own female elements, the species tried to gain some psychological distance from the great natural source from which it was, for its own reasons, trying to emerge. In the world of your present experience, sexual differences are less apparent as you reach old age. Some women display what you think of as masculine characteristics, growing hair about their faces, speaking with heavier voices, or becoming angular, while some men speak with lighter, gentler tones than ever before, and their faces grow smoother and the contours of their bodies soften. Before puberty, there is the same kind of seeming ambiguity. You stress the importance of sexual identification, for it seems to you that a young child must know that it will grow up to be a man or a woman in the most precise of terms, towing the line in the least particular. The slightest deviation is looked upon with dismay, so that personal identity and worth are completely tied into identification with femaleness or maleness. Completely different characteristics, abilities, and performances are expected from those in each category. A male who does not feel himself fully male, therefore does not trust his identity as a person. A woman doubtful of her complete femininity in the same manner does not trust the integrity of her personhood. A lesbian or homosexual is on very shifting psychological ground, because the same interests and abilities that they feel most personally theirs are precisely those that mark them as sexual eccentrics. These are simply enough examples. But the man who possesses interests considered feminine by your culture, who naturally wants to enter fields of interest considered womanly, experiences drastic conflicts between his sense of personhood and identity and his sexuality as it is culturally defined. The same, of course, applies to women. Because of your exaggerated focus, you therefore become relatively blind to other aspects of sexuality. First of all, sexuality per se does not necessarily lead to intercourse. It can lead to acts that do not produce children. What you think of as lesbian or homosexual activity is quite natural sexual expression, biologically and psychologically. In more ideal environments, such activity would flourish to some extent, particularly before and after prime reproductive years. For those literal-minded readers, this does not mean that such activity would predominate at such times. It does mean that not all sexual activity is meant to end in childbirth, which is a biological impossibility and would represent planetary catastrophe. So, the species is blessed, if you will, with many avenues for sexual expression. The strong focus that now predominates does inhibit the formation of certain kinds of friendships that would not necessarily at all result in sexual activity. Lesbianism and homosexuality, as they are currently experienced, also represent exaggerated versions of natural inclinations, even as your experienced version of heterosexuality is exaggerated. The so-called battle of the sexes with its ramifications is not natural, nor in that context is fighting between members of the same sex. Even in the animal kingdom, for example, males do not fight to the death over the females when they are in their natural state. I will clear up my meaning of the word natural later. However, when you examine animal behavior, even in its most natural seeming environment, for instance, you are not observing the basic behavior patterns of such creatures because those relatively isolated areas exist in your world. Quite simply, you cannot have 1 or 2 or 20 officially designated natural regions in which you observe animal activity and expect to find anything more than the current adaptation of those creatures, an adaptation that is superimposed upon their natural reactions. The balance of resources, animal travel patterns, migrations, weather conditions, all of these must be taken into consideration. Such isolated observation areas merely present you with a distorted picture of natural behavior because the animals are also imprisoned within them. Civilization binds them round. Other animals are kept out. The hunted and the prey are highly regulated. All areas of animal behavior alter to fit the circumstances as much as possible, and this includes sexual activity. To some extent, the animals have been conditioned to the changing world. Now, man is obviously a part of nature, so you may say, but those changes wrought by him are natural. When he studies such animal behavior, however, and sometimes uses the sexual patterns of the animals to make certain points about human sexuality, then man does not take this into consideration, but speaks as if the present observed animal behavior is the indication of a prime or basic nature inherent in their biology. It is not natural, then, for men to fight over women. This is a purely cultural, learned behavior. In terms of history, as you understand it, the species could not withstand such misapplied energy, nor could it have withstood such constant antagonism. Each species is involved in a cooperative venture upon which ultimately all earthly existence rests. You project your present beliefs backward into history, and you misinterpret many of the conditions that you observe in the natural world. This cooperation that I speak of, based on love, and that love has a biological as well as a spiritual basis. Your beliefs, for example, cause you to deny the existence of emotions in animals, and any instances of love among them are assigned to blind instinct. To some extent, the churches, as well as the scientists, are responsible, but priests and scientists are not some foreign people thrust upon you. They represent various aspects of yourself. The species developed its own kind of consciousness, as it found it necessary to isolate itself to some degree from its environment and the other creatures within it. As a result, the religions preached that only man had a soul and was dignified by emotional feelings. In its way, science went along very nicely by postulating man in a mechanistic world, with each creature run by an impeccable machine of instinct, blind alike to pain or desire. The love and cooperation that forms the basis of life, however, shows itself in many ways. Sexuality represents one aspect, and an important one. In larger terms, it is as natural for a man to love a man and a woman to love a woman as it is to show love for the opposite sex. For that matter, it is more natural to be bisexual. Such is the natural nature of the species. Instead, you have put love into the very definite categories so that its existence is right only under the most limited conditions. Love goes underground, but springs up in distorted forms and exaggerated tendencies. You have followed this course for different reasons at different times. Neither sex is to blame. Instead, your sexual situation is simply another reflection of the state of your consciousness. As a species, presently, at least in the Western world, you equate sex and love. You imagine that sexual expression is the only one natural to love. Love, in other words, must, it seems, express itself exclusively through the exploration, in one way or another, of the beloved's sexual portions. This is hardly the only limitation placed upon love's expression, however. There are innumerable books written with instructions, each proclaiming the said methods to be the proper ones. Certain kinds of orgasms are the best. Love's expression is furthermore permitted only between members of the opposite sex. Generally speaking, these individuals must be more or less the same age. There are other taboos involving racial restrictions, or cultural, social, or economic ones. If this were not enough, large segments of the population believe that sex is wrong to begin with, a spiritual debasement, allowed by God only so that the species can continue. Since love and sex are equated, obvious conflicts arise. Mother love is the only category that is considered wholesome, and therefore non-sexual under most conditions. A father can feel very guilty about his love for his children, for he has been conditioned to believe that love is expressed only through sex, or else it is unmanly, while sex with one's children is taboo. Creativity rides the tides of love. When love is denied its natural expression, creativity suffers. Your belief leads you to suppose that a natural bisexuality would result in the death of the family, the destruction of morals, rampant sexual crimes, and the loss of sexual identity. I would say, however, that my last sentence adequately describes your present situation. The acceptance of the species' natural bisexuality would ultimately help solve not only those problems, but many others, including the large instances of violence and acts of murder. In your terms, however, and in your circumstances, there is not apt to be any easy transition. The parent-child relationship has its own unique emotional structure, which survives even those distortions that you have placed upon it, and its ancient integrity would not be weakened, but strengthened if greater stress were laid upon your bisexual nature. Children would fare better if the ancient parental qualities were not so forcibly focused upon the mother. This in itself leads to more dependence upon the mother than is healthy, and forms an artificial allegiance between the mother and child against the father. Heterosexual love is one important expression of bisexuality, and sexuality represents the reproductive abilities. Let me read that sentence again. Heterosexual love is one important expression of bisexuality, and sexuality represents the reproductive abilities. Heterosexuality, however, rests upon the bisexual basis, and without man's bisexual nature, the larger frameworks of the family, the clan, tribe, government, civilization, would be impossible. Basically, then, man's inherent bisexuality provides the basis for the cooperation that makes physical survival and any kind of cultural interaction possible. If the battle of the sexes were as prevalent as supposed and as natural and ferocious, then there literally would be no cooperation between males and females for any purpose. There would be none between men or between women either, for they would be in a constant state of battle against each other. In the natural biological flow of a person's life, there are periods of varying intensity in which love and its expression fluctuates and tends toward different courses. There are also individual variations that are of great importance. These natural rhythms are seldom observed, however. Tendencies towards lesbianism or homosexuality in children are quite natural. They are so feared, however, that often just as natural leanings towards heterosexuality are blocked. Instead, the young person is stereotyped. Individual inclinations towards creativity often emerge in a strong fashion in adolescence, if those drives in either sex do not conform in expression to those expected of the male or female, then such young persons become confused. The creative expression seems to be in direct contradiction to the sexual standards expected. I am not saying that lesbianism and homosexuality are merely stages leading to heterosexuality. I am saying that lesbianism, homosexuality, and heterosexuality are valid expressions of man's bisexual nature. I'm also stressing the fact that love and sexuality are not necessarily the same thing. Sex is love's expression, but it is only one of love's expressions. Sometimes it's quite natural to express love in another way. Because of the connotations of the word sex, however, it may seem to some of you that I am advocating a promiscuous sexual relationship with no holes barred. You may delete that. Instead, I am saying that deeper bonds of biological and spiritual love lie at the basis of all personal and cultural relationships, a love that transcends your ideas of sexuality. Heterosexual love, as it is understood at least, gives you a family of parents and children, an important unit about which other groups form. If only stereotyped ideas of female-male relationships operated, however, there would be no bond or stimulus great enough to forge one family to another. The antagonism between males would be too great. Competition between females would be too severe. Wars would wipe out struggling tribes before any traditions were formed. In the social world, as in the microscopic one, cooperation again is paramount. Only a basic bisexuality could give the species the leeway necessary and prevent stereotyped behavior of a kind that would hamper creativity and social commerce. That basic sexual nature allows you the fulfillment of individual abilities so that the species does not fall into extinction. Man's recognition of his bisexual nature is therefore a must in his future. There are again obvious differences between the sexes. They are insignificant and appear large only because you concentrate so upon them. The great human qualities of love, strength, compassion, intellect, and imagination do not belong to one sex or another. Only an understanding of this inherent bisexual nature will release those qualities in each individual, regardless of sex. Those same abilities are natural characteristics of people in each race, of course, yet you have consistently made the same kind of distinctions in racial terms as you have in sexual ones, so that certain races appear as feminine or masculine to you. You project your sexual beliefs outward upon the nations, and then often the terminology of the nations and of wars is the same as that used to describe sex. You speak, for example, of domination and submission, of the master and the slave, of the rape of a nation, terms used in war and sex alike. Male and female are each members of the human race, or species if you prefer. So these divisions were made in the species itself by itself. They are the result of distinctions arising, again, as the species experimented with its line of consciousness and brought into being the appearance of separation between itself and the rest of the natural world. Your identity is not simply dependent upon your psychological or biological sexuality. Your sexual characteristics represent a portion of your personhood. They provide vital areas of expression and focal points about which to group experience. Your sexual qualities are a part of your nature, but they do not define it. Your beliefs so structure your experience individually and en masse, however, that evidential material contrary to those ideas shows itself, but seldom or in distorted or exaggerated form. It is quite natural, biologically and psychologically, to operate in certain fashions that are not acceptable in your society, that seem to run counter to your picture of mankind's history. In terms of your definitions, then, it's quite natural for some people to behave as males sexually and as females psychologically. It is also quite natural for others to operate in the reverse fashion. Again, this may seem difficult to understand because you assign psychological characteristics to a sexual affiliation, whatever it is. There will always be people who naturally seek the experience of parenthood. All of them will not necessarily be heterosexual at any given time. The larger pattern of human personhood demands a bisexual affiliation that allows leeway in sexual encounters, a leeway that provides a framework in which individuals can express feelings, abilities, and characteristics that follow the natural inclines of the personal psyche rather than sexual stereotypes. I am not speaking here of anything so simple as merely allowing women more freedom or relieving men from the conventional breadwinner's role. I am certainly not talking about open marriage as it is currently understood, but of far greater issues. Before we can consider these, however, there are several points I would like to make. There are biological possibilities seldom activated in your present circumstances that have some bearing upon the subject at hand. Puberty comes at a certain time, triggered by deep mechanisms that are related to the state of the natural world, the condition of the species, and those cultural beliefs that, in a certain sense, you transpose upon the natural world. In other respects, your cultural environment is, of course, natural. The time that puberty comes varies, and afterwards it is possible to parent a child at a time when a time then comes when the period is over. During what is called the sexually active time, the larger dimensions of personhood become strictly narrowed into sexual stereotyped roles, and all aspects of identity that do not fit are ignored or denied. The fact is that few people fit those roles. They are largely the result of the interpretations of religion as conventionally understood, and the scientists, for all their seeming independence, often simply found new intellectually accepted reasons for unconsciously held emotional beliefs. Biologically, there is a period very rarely experienced, as jokingly suggested in the sick jokes about senility and a second childhood. This particular latent biological ability shows itself only upon the rarest instances, because for one thing, it represents a feat now scarcely desirable. Physically, however, the body is quite able to completely regenerate itself as it approaches old age. Indeed, a quite legitimate second puberty is possible, in which the male's seed is youthfully strong and vital, and the woman's womb is pliable and able to bear. There are, I believe, biblical tales of such births resulting. In times of overpopulation, this mechanism is hardly desirable, but it is part of the species held in abeyance now, representing nature's capabilities. In some areas of your world, isolated peoples live on past 100 years, vital and strong, because they are untouched by your beliefs, and because they live in sympathy and in accord with the world as they know it and understand it. Occasionally, such second puberties happen then, with resulting childbirth, as a small group attempts to maintain its own biological stance. Usually, the second puberty follows the same sexual orientation as the first, but not always, for it is quite possible for the new affiliation to be the opposite of the first. This is even rarer, but so does the species protect itself. Through medical techniques, some of your old people are kept alive long enough so that this process begins, appearing in distorted form, sometimes psychologically apparent, but biologically frustrated. Second puberty is dead-ended then. It has nowhere to go, and it is not now biologically pertinent or needed. Left alone, some of these people would die with a feeling of satisfaction. Kept alive through medical techniques, the physical mechanism continues to struggle to revitalize the body and bring about the second puberty that naturally would only come about under different conditions, with the mind far more alert and the will unimpaired. Now, to some extent, there is a connection between this innate, rarely observed second puberty and the development of cancer, in which growth is specifically apparent in an exaggerated manner. In almost all such cases involving cancer, spiritual and psychic growth is being denied, or the individual feels that he or she can no longer grow properly. In personal psychic terms, this attempt to grow then activates body mechanisms that result in the overgrowth of certain cells. The individual insists upon growing or upon death, and forces an artificial situation in which growth itself becomes physically disastrous. This is because a blockage occurs. The individual wants to grow in terms of personhood, but is afraid of doing so. There are always individual variations that must be taken into consideration, but often such a person feels a martyr to his or her own sex, imprisoned by it and unable to escape. This can obviously apply to cancers affecting sexual areas, but it is often in the background of such a condition. Energy is being blocked because of problems that began, in your terms, with sexual questions in puberty. Energy is experienced as sexual. Now, old people who are considered senile or unmanageable are sometimes experiencing new bursts of sexual activity for which no outlet is given. Beside this, they have lost their conventional sexual roles in which they earlier expressed their energy. There are often hormonal changes occurring that go unnoticed. Many express a nervous, erratic type of behavior as they are aroused. Some, not only sexually, but intellectually. The new adolescence never comes. The new puberty dies a slow death, for your society has no framework in which to understand it, and indeed it shows itself in a distorted fashion that can appear more grotesque. Love is a biological necessity, a force operating to one degree or another in all biological life. Without love, there is no physical commitment to life, no psychic hold. Love exists, whether or not it is sexually expressed, though it is natural for love to seek expression. Love implies loyalty. It implies commitment. This applies to lesbian and homosexual relationships, as well as to heterosexual ones. In your society, however, identity is so related to sexual stereotypes that few people know themselves well enough to understand the nature of love and to make any such commitments. A transitory period is currently taking place in which women seem to seek the promiscuous sexual freedom more generally granted to men. It is believed that males are naturally promiscuous, aroused by sexual stimuli, almost completely divorced from any complementary deeper response. The male, then, is thought to want sex whether or not he has any love response to the woman in question, or sometimes to desire her precisely because he does not love her. In such cases, sex becomes not an expression of love, but an expression of derision or scorn. So, women accepting these ideas often seek for a situation in which they too can feel free to express their sexual desires openly, whether or not any love is involved. Yet loyalty is love's partner, and the primates display such evidence in varying degrees. The male in particular has been taught to separate love and sex, so that a schizophrenic condition results that tears apart his psyche in operational terms as he lives his life. The expression of sexuality is considered male, while the expression of love is not considered manly. To some extent or another, then, the male feels forced to divide the expression of his love from the expression of his sexuality. It would be disastrous for women to follow the same course. This great division has led to your major wars. This does not mean that men were alone responsible for wars. It does mean that the male so divorced himself from the common fountain of love and sex that the repressed energy came forth in those aggressive acts of cultural rape and death instead of birth. When you look at the animal kingdom, you suppose that the male chooses blindly, led by dumb instinct, so that in overall terms one female will do as well as any other. When you discover that a certain chemical or a scent will attract a certain male insect, for example, you take it for granted that that element is alone responsible for drawing the male to the female. You take it for granted, in other words, that individual differences do not apply in such cases so remote from your own reality. You simply are not able to understand the nature of such consciousnesses, and so you interpret their behavior according to your beliefs. This would be sad enough if you did not often use such distorted data to further define the nature of male and female behavior. In so distorting your ideas of sex, you further limit the great capacities of human loyalty, which is always connected with love and love's expression. Lesbian and homosexual relationships then are at best tenuous, overwrought with confused emotions, very seldom able to maintain a stability that allows for individual growth. Heterosexual relationships also break down, for the identity of each partner becomes based upon sexual roles that may or may not apply to the individuals involved. Since you feel that sex is the only proper method of love's expression, and yet also believe that sex and love are divided, you are in a quandary. These sexual beliefs are also far more important in national relationships than you realize, for you attempt to take what you think of as masculine stance as a nation. For example, does Russia, does Russia. India takes a feminine stance in your terms of beliefs. One small note here: a male with growth of any kind, kidney stones or ulcers, a male with growths, a male with growths of any kind, kidney stones or ulcers, for example, has tendencies he considers feminine, therefore dependent, of which he is ashamed. In a mock biological ceremony, he gives birth to the extent that he produces within his body material that was not there before. In ulcers, the stomach becomes the womb, bloodied, giving birth to sores, his interpretation of a male's grotesque attempt to express feminine characteristics.